Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Anya Pichenina, and I'm a program officer focusing on research translation work at the Kauffman Foundation. Today's forum's title is The Great Resignation in Entrepreneurship. According to the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 4.3 million Americans quit their jobs in December of 2021. This represents the continuation of a trend called the Great Resignation. At the same time, existing businesses were looking for talent to fill 10.9 million open positions. So where did all of these workers go? Well, many workers are quitting their jobs in order to start new jobs. Others are retiring or leaving the labor market entirely. Some, however, are starting new businesses or pursuing self-employment. Today, we will hear from scholars looking at these labor market trends and discuss what the Great Resignation might mean for new business creation and entrepreneurship, as well as the potential long-term effects of this trend on the business landscape in the United States. We have two exciting panels for you today. In our first panel, we will discuss why are people leaving jobs and what does it mean for entrepreneurship. And in our second panel, we will explore the potential long-term effects of Great Resignation on business landscape and self-employment. After each panel, we will have a moderated Q&A, and I encourage you to send your questions to us in the Q&A box throughout the presentations. The link to the agenda for this event is also going to be posted in the chat window. I would like to thank each one of our presenters today for taking the time out of their very busy lives to share their insights with us. And with that, I want to also make a disclaimer that we host this forum to provide a platform for an in-depth discussion on how to solve problems. And Kauffman Foundation does not take a political or legislative position on these discussions. So with that, I would like to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Ms. Melody Chang. Melody, the floor is yours.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Melody Chang, PhD candidate at Yale University. I'll be moderating our first session today on why are people leaving jobs and what does it mean for entrepreneurship. So it is my pleasure to introduce four incredible panelists today who are experts in this topic area. So we'll be hearing from Dr. John Haltiwanger, Distinguished University Professor of Economics at University of Maryland, Dr. Chunbei Wang, Assistant Professor of Economics at University of Oklahoma, Dr. Howard Wial, Senior Vice President and Director of Research Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, and Miles Chandler, a Senior Research Analyst with Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. I'm very excited about the session today as my research focuses on careers and labor market strategies of entrepreneurs. So I've been really intrigued by this phenomenon, the Great Resignation. So after the presentations, we will have 10 to 15 minutes of a Q&A session. So please start using the Q&A box to submit any questions that you would like to ask the panelists. So without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Dr. John Haltiwanger at University of Maryland. He has been using longitudinal databases and advanced statistical measurement methods to study important labor market dynamics. He has published more than 100 academic articles, received numerous awards, and he also published several books, including Job Creation and Destruction. So now, Dr. Haltiwanger, over to you.
Great to be on this panel. We are in an extraordinary time in the U.S. economy. Obviously, we've gone through just a terrible time, but as we are emerging from this pandemic, we are changing the way we work, and we're changing the way we're doing businesses, and the reallocation of workers is playing a major role. And I'd like to try to put a little bit of that in perspective and talk a little bit about what I think is going on. So one thing is. The term "Great Resignation" is a clever term. I don't think the term is necessarily misleading, but one thing that is misleading is that people don't quit for the most part to leave the labor market or to become unemployed. They quit because there's a better opportunity. And so what am I showing here? I've actually spent time looking, for example, historically at the pattern of quits and job-to-job flows. And in some work I did with Steve Davis at the University of Chicago and Jason Faberman, who's at the Chicago Fed, we were able to produce some quit series even before JOLTS, so just to put things into perspective. And so what we've seen in the past again is when quits are really high, that's a very robust labor market. In many times it's a healthy, dynamic labor market where workers are moving up the job ladder. And so you do see in the aggregate data, but we also have done micro studies that for the most part, when workers quit, they take a better job. They literally move up the productivity ladder, and they move up the wage ladder. This is an important source of earnings gains, actually, particularly for workers at the bottom of the ladder and workers who are relatively new to the ladder. That is, relatively young workers, and low wage workers. So, in many ways, this typically is a really good thing. I think there are some differences going on given the extraordinary period we've just been through. So it's clear, even looking on this data set all the way back to early 1990s, quits are higher than they've ever been, and that's partly why we're here today. So also something that's extraordinary is there's information from the Census Bureau, from the Business Formation Statistics, that applications for new businesses are at all-time highs as far as back as we can measure them. We can only measure these particular applications back to the mid-2004, but you can see here quickly, and here I'm just showing you the number of applications, that the surge has been remarkable and persistent. 2021 was the highest year on record. There's some ups and downs across months, but again, an enormous surge. These new business applications aren't yet businesses yet, and I want to talk a little bit about that. There's information on the form, so why do you need an EIN? Well, if you're going to be a new employer business, you have to have an EIN, because you need that to be able to pay unemployment insurance taxes and payroll taxes. Why do you need it if you're going to be a self-employed non-employer? Well, actually, in many cases, if you're a new non-employer and you want to have business-to-business activity, you want to have a business banking account, you need an EIN. And we see a tight relationship. Here I'm just showing you on one side. We see a tight relationship between those businesses that indicate that they plan to hire workers and actual business formations. One of the very nice things out of, if you haven't spent time poring over the business formation statistics, is not only to have the application series, but they actually have the actual transitions that are related to those applications. So that data comes in with a lag. We only know that up to 2019. So what I'm showing you here is for any given month over the from the 2004 period through 2017, I'm showing you the actual startups that occurred as a result of these applications. And that's through the links to what's called the longitudinal business database at the US Census Bureau. Now, after 2017, because that data is not after the 2019 data, remember I'm looking 2 years forward here. These are projections, and are we confident about these projections? Well, we're not quite sure yet, but based upon historical record, we have every reason to suspect that things will continue. So this has been, I'll say, a remarkable surge in applications, and we think a remarkable surge in actual business formation. It's worth noting that the evidence is that when they apply for new EIN, that's relatively early to the startup. That actually the actual startups occur somewhere over 4 to 8 quarters after the application. So a huge surge in 2021 should translate into surges in 2022. And the question, when we'll see that in the hard data. And if we have time in the Q&A, I'd be happy to chat about that. And the other thing that's striking about these new business application series is it's concentrated in a relatively small fraction of industries. So there's roughly 100 what we call 3-digit NAICS industries. I'm showing you the top 5 in terms of the increase in 2021, and the top 10 industries. These industries alone count for a very large fraction, but the top 10 industries out of 100 account for 2/3 of the increase. So you can see, interestingly, you can see where are we seeing these new business applications in many ways precisely where you might think, given the restructuring the pandemic, you should see. We've seen an enormous surge in e-commerce related activity, non-store retailers. We've also seen, interestingly, a surge in professional, scientific, and technical services. I think that's actually reflecting two things. Actually, that's one of the places where the kind of applications that we're using remotely get designed. But it's also a place where lots of STEM-intensive workers have figured out, well, wait a second, I don't necessarily need to be associated with an individual firm. I can go out on my own and contract out to a whole bunch of firms. So I think we're seeing a surge. In fact, we do see a surge for both in kind of the likely new employers and non-employers. You can also see truck transportation, for example, as others as well, took off as well. Again, that makes sense given the nature of the way that businesses and consumers are interacting is changing, and of course the huge supply side constraints. So are all these things connected? I don't think we fully know yet. Not from at least the data that's sitting at the state agencies. I'll be interested to hear from my colleagues about what else they see. So I just put indexes of all these series for these top 3 business formation series, and they are trending all upward. But I think it's a mistake to obviously the simple correlations here aren't convincing in terms of exactly what's going on. But I think a key issue, and this was nicely brought up in the introductory remarks, is one thing a very robust labor market does, and I'll conclude with this slide in thought, is a very robust labor market is an environment where if you decide to go out on your own, you're not taking as much risk as other times. Because what do we know about business startups? I've been studying business startups for 30 years. So within the first 5 years, more than half of them are unlikely to will not make it. They'll exit. Now, it's much easier to take that risk if you know you're going to land on your feet. And as was stated at the beginning, this is a time in which if you start up your own business and it doesn't work out, that you can go back and get a wage and salary job with high probability. Here I'm showing you a statistic that's closely related to the introductory remarks. Businesses who are hiring wage and salary workers are finding it actually remarkably hard to do so. So you can see actually the highest per vacancy is at the lowest ever. And basically that says all these vacancies out there and businesses are finding a hard time to hire workers. Why is that relevant in the case of entrepreneurship? Partly maybe because the individuals aren't going to find wage and salary jobs for starting their own business, but also this is highly relevant because it means that it's easier to take on the risk given the risk of failure of new businesses. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for sharing the helpful statistics and highlighting key implications. So now let me introduce our second panelist, Dr. Chunbei Wang. So Dr. Wang is an assistant professor at University of Oklahoma and fellow at Global Labor Organization. Dr. Wang produced many impactful work on immigration and entrepreneurship and how family and gender affect labor demand. So Chunbei, whenever you're ready.
Thanks for having me. So as Dr. Haltiwanger has just showed that the quit rate has been very high and reached an all-time high since April of 2021. So that inspired a lot of questions and discussions about what's driving that high quit rate. The JOLTS data do not tell us a lot of about where these quitters are going, why are they quitting. So there's been a lot of speculations out there. For example, people are worried that are these people quitting to leave the labor force? For example, is this an anti-work movement? Are they quitting to take care of family, or are they retiring early? On the other hand, there are also voices that show that maybe this quitting is commensurate with the job openings rate. People are simply quitting to switch jobs, and there are a lot of job openings. People are quitting to find better jobs out there, and some of them may be becoming a business owner. And what I'm trying to do here is to try to use some other data set to try to find if there's any kind of pattern or that could provide some extra insight into this issue. And the data that I explored a little bit was the current population survey, which allow us to observe the next month status of those who are currently employed in the wage salary sector. So, among people at any month, among people who are currently employed in the wage salary sector, we can observe whether or not they remain employed in the next month. So either in the same job or a different job, or they become unemployed or leave the labor force or become self-employed or start a business. So this first figure shows that at any month among those currently in the wage salary sector, what's the proportion that leaves that sector in the following month? If the quiz are representing people who are leaving the labor force, then we should see an increase in leaving the wage salary sector. So in this figure here, we can see this red line here is the original data, the monthly averages of the proportion leaving the wage salary sector. And this vertical line over here is the start of the pandemic, and the second vertical line is the April 2021, the start of the so-called Great Resignation. And if we look at this figure, the post-April 2021 period basically is comparable to the pre-pandemic period. So we do see that right around the start of the pandemic, there's a hike in the proportion of people leaving the wage sector. So a lot of these are unemployed. A lot of them left the labor force at the point, maybe to take care of kids who are out of school. And so we see this hike, but then it came back down very quickly and reached the pre-pandemic level. So from this figure, my read into this is that this suggests that there's no massive outflow from the wage salary sector. The job quitters are most likely moving on to a different job. And then the next few slides further dig into this and look at when among those people who leave the wage salary sector, what's the percentage that becomes unemployed or leave the labor force or become self-employed? The first one shows the portion that becomes unemployed. Again, there's a big hike right around the start of the pandemic, but then it came back down very quickly and back to the pre-pandemic level since the April 2021 mark. The next one shows the proportion that leaves the labor force. Again, the same pattern, right around the start of the pandemic, there's a hike in the percentage of people who left the labor force at the time, but then it came back down to the pre-pandemic level. So the next slide shows, the proportion that becomes self-employed. This is the most relevant in this, to this panel, but it's showing that the proportion of people who left the wage salary sector to enter self-employment declined when the pandemic started and then came back up, but then now we're just kind of at the same level as the pre-pandemic level. So a summary of this few slides shows that there's no increased outflow, flow out of the wage salary sector. So the higher quit rate most likely reflects more job switching. And I'm not seeing any increase in people directly switching from a wage salary sector job to self-employment. But an interesting phenomenon that has been documented, and also Dr. Haltiwanger has mentioned, is that there's actually an increase in the number of self-employed. And I'm showing here, this is based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates. We're seeing a substantial increase in the number of, especially the number of unincorporated self-employed since 2021. So this is actually consistent with my own calculation of the overall self-employment entry rate. So these are the new entries into self-employment. Self-employment entry rate has increased after the onset of the pandemic and remain at a higher level than the pre-pandemic period. Since I already showed that we are not seeing people directly switching from wage sector to self-employment, then this must be mainly driven by those who have been unemployed or out of the labor force. And my hypothesis would be that very likely, since the start of the pandemic, a lot of people were unemployed, they left the labor force, and then they're gradually coming back. And one of the more popular options now is they're coming back to become self-employed. And there may be many reasons for that. One reason I think is maybe people are looking for a more flexible work schedule or more work autonomy. And the group that would most likely to be making this kind of choice, the demographic group I would suspect would be females, because of the need to look for more work-family balance. So the next slide here shows the self-employment entry rate by gender. We can see that for female compared to male, in general, male has a higher self-employment entry rate, but the increase since the pandemic and also after the April 2021 period is most prominent among the female workers. So we're seeing this big jump here after the start of the pandemic, and then remained a high level for female. And on the other hand, for male, we can see also a jump, but then it came back down after April 2021. So summarizing all of that, we're seeing an increase in self-employment entries since the onset of pandemic, and this is mostly driven by those who are unemployed or out of the labor force, and is mostly driven by women. I think the story probably most consistent with this kind of data pattern will be that a lot of women left the labor force when the pandemic started or become unemployed. But then when they return to the labor force, they're probably looking for more work-family balance, and self-employment appeared to be a good option. Of course, we're going to need more data to see that, but this is based on the current data pattern that I observed. That's I think that's a very likely explanation. So that's my thought, and I would welcome any questions. If you have any, please type it in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I think now we learned a lot about why people leave the labor force and where they go. So next we have Dr. Howard Wial at Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. So he's a specialist in urban and regional economic development, promoting a revitalization of economically depressed communities. He has an extensive experience as an economist and economic policy advisor, serving at various institutes, including the Brookings Institute and the US Department of Labor. So now I'll hand over the floor to Dr. Wial.
Okay, I'd like to do two things in the time we have available. First, I'd like to provide some context, some broader economic context for the Great Resignation phenomenon by showing you some results from a resource tool that we at the Initiative for the Competitive Inner City have developed with the generous support of the Kauffman Foundation. And second, I'd like to show you a few data snapshots that shed some light on the Great Resignation phenomenon. Our business recovery tracker, which we developed with the Kauffman Foundation's support, presents what we believe to be the most detailed and comprehensive information about what's happened to businesses and jobs in each of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the US during the coronavirus recession and recovery. We're doing this on a quarterly basis. Right now, our data are current through the third quarter of last year. They will next month be current through the end of last year. What we do that nobody else does is to be able to provide very, very detailed information about what has happened to the recovery of businesses and the recovery of jobs by industry, which of course is something that others do as well. It's available publicly, but by size of business, are small businesses really having a harder time recovering than larger ones? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about that. We've got some information there. What's happening by race and ethnicity? Are business owners of color doing worse than white business owners in terms of business and job recovery? And finally, under-resourced communities and non-under-resourced communities within each metropolitan area. Under-resourced communities are large areas of high poverty and low income that are located in cities and suburbs. We not only show information for the metropolitan area as a whole, but we split out the under-resourced communities from the rest of the metropolitan area. And we do all this using proprietary data. So let me show you a few top-line results. First of all, if you compare third quarter 2021 businesses and jobs with what they were at the beginning of the pandemic, you see that jobs have recovered more strongly than businesses. As of third quarter of last year, the top 100 metropolitan areas as a whole had 92% of the jobs that they had at the start of the pandemic, only 86% of the businesses that they had at that time. If we look at businesses by size, we see that yes, indeed, smaller businesses are having a harder time recovering than bigger ones. The smallest businesses, those with 1 to 4 employees, have recovered only 82% of the jobs that they had at the beginning of the pandemic, compared with 97% for the larger businesses with 100 or more employees. In terms of race and ethnicity of business owners, we see that if we compare the second to third quarter of last year, there was the most growth in employment in Black-owned businesses. Other businesses owned by people of color also had stronger quarter-to-quarter employment growth than businesses owned by white owners. So those are some quick insights from our tracker. We didn't see a whole lot of difference between under-resourced communities and other parts of the metropolitan area. For the 100 largest metropolitan areas as a whole, you can look at our detailed results for individual metropolitan areas and individual categories at the URL that I'm showing on my screen. And I will now turn the screen over to my colleague, Miles Chandler, who will show some results for a particular metropolitan area so you can see how our tracker works.
Okay, so yeah, like Howard said, we have every quarter we've been publishing kind of the top line results and digging into those I guess most important trends. But in addition to those reports, we've been updating this data dashboard regularly. The data are filtered by the top 100 metro areas and also those sub-geographies that Howard had mentioned. So for example, if we wanted to look at Kansas City and investigate how things have been progressing with the recession in the under-resourced communities of Kansas City, where we might expect the effects of the recession to be greatest, we can do that filtering. So here we have businesses and jobs within just the under-resourced communities of Kansas City. You can see that over the past couple of quarters, businesses have actually been recovering faster than employment. So in that particular area, there is some evidence for a labor shortage. If we want to investigate, well, what could be driving those things? We can actually break out both businesses and jobs by industry. So these are NAICS, the 2-digit NAICS codes I've been looking at, and we're plotting both real numbers and percent change from the past, from the first quarter of the pandemic, which we're calling the second quarter of 2020. So we can look across here. Healthcare seems to be particularly big in the under-resourced communities of Kansas City, both by jobs and number of businesses. The greatest percent changes are often in the smallest industries in any particular area. Can also break things out, as Howard mentioned, by the size category of businesses. So there's quite a few very small, so either non-employer or very small employer firms, although the distribution of jobs is more even. And then finally, down here at the bottom, we have some race and ethnicity categories, which can also the race and ethnicity of the business owner. So if we want to see how white-owned businesses are faring compared to people of color, you can see that they account for a majority of businesses in the under-resourced communities of Kansas City, but aren't ranking among the highest by change. Those are actually Asian-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, although by jobs, things are, again, a little different. So this offers a level of granularity that you can't really get through our quarterly reports, and it's very customizable. So if you're in the business of number shopping, this is a great tool to help you out with that. Yeah, great.
Great. Thanks, Miles. Let me continue with some nuggets of data that are more directly relevant to the Great Resignation itself. First, which industries were most resilient during the pandemic? Well, if we look at the BLS data on job changes from February 2020 to December 2021, we see that the most resilient industries, the ones that have had the greatest increase in employment over that period, are transportation and warehousing, a very heterogeneous category, but as a whole, it's up quite robustly. Professional technical services, administrative and waste, retail, trade, and construction are also up. At the other extreme, mining and logging is down by more than a quarter from its pre-pandemic level. And unsurprisingly, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation and food services are also down considerably, and some other industries you can see are also down. So what does this mean in terms of job flows? Is there any relationship between this and between the resilience of industries and job flows? In short, apparently not. Now, we're just taking a data snapshot here. We're looking at net job inflows by industry in December. And we're comparing December 2021 here with the corresponding pre-pandemic month of December 2019. And we see that the greatest increases in net inflows between pre-pandemic and pandemic periods in December were in utilities, arts, entertainment and recreation, public administration and information, and the largest net outflows or increase in net outflows came in real estate and rental and leasing. But if you look at the yellow highlighted industries, those are the ones that were most resilient in terms of recovery of jobs. They're mostly in the middle. There's really not much relationship between net inflows or outflows and the resilience of industries, at least in this December to December snapshot. Are more people resigning to start businesses? Basically, here we're using the same source that Dr. Wang used, and unsurprisingly, we are coming up with the same general kind of result. Again, we're just here looking at November to December changes, and we're comparing November to December 2021 with November to December 2019. And if anything, there's a slightly smaller percentage of workers who were wage and salary workers in November of 21 who became self-employed in December than was the case in the corresponding pre-pandemic month. And as Dr. Wang pointed out, that could very well be due to movements from unemployment or out of the labor force status to self-employment. As Dr. Haltiwanger pointed out, it could also be that because of the data lag between business formations and actual startups, that we're just not seeing these flows happening yet, but we'll start to see them sometime in 2022. So overall, small businesses had more difficulty recovering than bigger ones. Businesses owned by people of color, especially Black-owned businesses, had especially fast growth in jobs during the third quarter of 2021. We don't see any relationship between net worker inflows or outflows and the resilience of industries, at least for the period that we looked at. And consistent with Dr. Wang's evidence, we have no evidence that workers were leaving to start jobs, or rather to start businesses in December 2021 in any greater numbers than they would have been before the pandemic at the same time of year. So that's what we have, and we welcome questions and comments.
Thank you, Howard and Miles, for introducing the novel recovery tracker data and sharing important insights from the tool. So I'd like to thank all panelists for your presentation today. And now I'd like to move on to our Q&A section and bring back everyone together. I encourage everyone in the audience to drop in any questions for the panelists. So we have been collecting several questions. I think they're first, I think, related to Howard and Wial's presentation. One of the questions relates to the top metros recovery trackers. So are you tracking any employee-owned businesses versus non-employee-owned businesses? And there have been several studies that have been looking into these ESOPs or worker cooperatives. So do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have any information in our tracker relevant to that. Although we are providing more granularity than anyone else is, that's a level of granularity that we just can't get at.
So I have a general question to all panelists. So we have seen differences in job creation and labor mobility patterns by gender and underserved communities. So how do you think the Great Resignation would impact inequality across different social groups?
I have some thoughts. This is a really first order question, and we'd love to know the answer to that. Again, I want to stress that a time of a robust job ladder is really good for individuals at the bottom of the ladder. Recent entrants, individuals with actually lower education, and other sort of disadvantages in the labor market, because it's an opportunity to move up. We've done lots of studies that in the past, when we're in a period of high quits and high job-to-job flows, this is quite helpful for, again, workers at the bottom and to help start closing the gap, because kind of a remarkable thing about the labor market is an important way that individuals increase their earnings over the course of their career is job hopping. And when job hopping collapses, which it collapsed terribly in the Great Recession, it was very slow to recover. That was a real damper. So I don't think we have the gold standard data on job-to-job flows yet on this point. The gold standard data, as I think of it, is the LEHD data. They have a job-to-job flow series. It's administrative data, it tracks everything. One problem with the administrative data relative to some of the survey data is it's not. We don't have it up through December 2021 yet, right? We barely have it early in the pandemic. So, do I think this is good for individuals who are at the bottom of the ladder? Yeah, I think this is probably very good.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Haltiwanger. Just a couple of insights from our work, that businesses owned by people of color, especially Black-owned businesses, have been doing relatively well in the later part of last year. That suggests a good job market for people of those racial and ethnic groups, and the fact that under-resourced communities are not doing any worse. Businesses in under-resourced communities are not doing any worse than businesses in non-under-resourced parts of the same metropolitan areas in terms of adding businesses, in terms of adding jobs. Also portends very well for people at the bottom of the wage scale. And so if they have better labor market opportunities, they may, as was pointed out earlier, may be more likely to feel comfortable starting businesses of their own.
So I think that question is also relevant for some of the questions that I received earlier. Well, what about the self-employment entry rate across different racial ethnic groups? by gender. And in fact, I've checked, for example, 3 major groups, whites, blacks, and Hispanics, and they are showing substantial increase in self-employment entry rate after the start of the pandemic, and especially among females. So we're not seeing a lot of racial or ethnic group differences, but more of gender differences. And what does that imply about, for example, gender inequality? You know, we don't have enough information at this point because we'll need to see, you know, how this business are going to perform, you know, when they start at a time like this.
So I put it in the chat, and so I want to say to both Chunbei and Howard and Miles, I'm a big user of the CPS as well, but I think the CPS is unfortunately relatively weak in terms of self-employment. It's you know, we depend upon the CPS. It's you know, it provides us the unemployment rate. I think there's lots of evidence that it does a good job of capturing the main activity of individuals. So when the enumerator comes and asks you what you're doing, if you're a wage and salary worker and that's primarily what you're doing, that's what you're going to say. If you regard yourself as primarily retired, but maybe you're doing a little on the side, that you're going to say you're retired. If you're a student, even if you've got a job, you're going to say you're a student. And so why does this matter, particularly for self-employment? Two things are true about self-employment. A lot of times it's a secondary activity or supplemental kind of activity. And the CPS is not good at multiple jobs. It's quite poor. Second, we've actually found, interestingly, and kind of fits with this whole, you know, what do you do when you want to start up a business? That there's evidence that don't quit your day job. That indeed many businesses that start up, when we've looked at the administrative data over time, is individuals start up a business, but they keep maintaining their wage and salary job. And so we capture that in the administrative data well. I don't think the CPS does. Just, I mean, I'm gonna, again, I don't want to be known on this panel as the CPS basher, but there's, you know, Catherine Abraham Abraham's the future, I mean, the past commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is a big fan of the CPS and so on. We did a study where we literally matched up the administrative data to the CPS to try to figure out what's going on, because the macro trends don't look the same. We found, I'll say remarkably, 70% of individuals we could find a match that were in the CPS who actually report self-employment activity in their taxes. So they're actually reporting on their taxes, don't report any self-employment activity on the CPS. So I worry about the CPS being, by the way, we need to look at it because it's the most timely data we've got, but I'm not convinced it's a great data set for a self-employment activity, particularly if it's accompanied by other activity, such as having a wage and salary job at the same time.
Sure, I can't disagree at all with that. We're just using the CPS for some snapshots because it is the most timely data source.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Haltiwanger. There are limitations of the CPS data, you know, that I also realize as well. But on the other hand, I think, you know, if people are doing some side businesses, you know, but then when it grows into a particular size, then very likely those will become the person's main job. And so then the entry rate will be capturing that kind of switch. So, but, you know, I agree with you. There are limitations to the CPS data. There are some activities that are not being captured, but I think the overall trend is showing the more, I guess, kind of a more serious type of self-employment, you know, treating it as a main job. So, and, you know, I still think it's very informative, and as Dr. Wial says, it's timely. So it provides some insights.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your insights about the data available and the limitations. So I'd like to shift the gear a little bit. So one of the questions that was asked was, Is there any data that compares US Great Resignation to other countries experiencing similar trends? So do you know how that this trend is in US compares with those in other countries?
Actually, I don't know about the quits as much, and maybe somebody else does who's followed the household survey data, but I do know that there is evidence of a rise in business formations in European countries. The UK is seeing a similar kind of increase. Their data is not as good as ours, it turns out. But people have asked me about this on the new application side, and indeed there is increasing evidence from the UK that we're seeing the same kind of pattern.
Thank you, John. So the next question is, what do you all think are the key research questions for academics and policymakers, and what kind of other future research topics that you're thinking about to investigate this new phenomenon?
I'm happy to jump in so other people can collect thoughts. I think there's big open questions as to whether we're seeing more persistent changes in the way we work and the way businesses organize themselves. And I think there's increasing evidence that we are, and I think it makes sense that new entrepreneurs are going to be critical for this ongoing restructuring of activity. And I think there's increased evidence that we're going to head back to hybrid, right? We're not all headed in 5 days a week. I think that's going to change the spatial nature of activity, and will require literally in many cases some different businesses and also different businesses supporting, right? So to the extent that more and more of us are working from home, then we need the same kind of support businesses that used to be kind of in the downtown office districts in where workers are. I guess the downtown office districts itself will evolve and so on. So I think huge questions about what role both what the quits are doing, but also what the startups are doing for this restructuring. I'll say one more thing, and then let others like to hear their thoughts. Is one thing that I have been paying a lot of attention to, I'll say up to 2019, is there's been a long run decline in the pace of startups in the United States, and we don't know yet. I mean, I think there's no doubt that this is a persistent surge. Have we reversed the trend? This pandemic's been terrible in many ways, but has it kind of given the U.S. again sort of its mojo in terms of startup activity? And if so, I mean, being maybe wildly too optimistic, is startups have traditionally played a critical role in innovation and experimentation and helping us change the way we do business. And that slowdown over the last 20 years, I think shows up in our innovation and productivity statistics. So the question is whether we can be, I'll say, cautiously optimistic that this restructuring is also going to enable us to see that kind of innovation productivity. Whether 5 years from now there'll be, just remember after the 1990s, we had this tremendous surge, and then there are household names now, right? That they grew out. It'd be very interesting to see which kind of startups that we're seeing now turn out to help us, basically help lead the way for the new economy in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify the geographic or spatial aspect that Professor Haltiwanger was touching on. If people who work in downtown office districts are not going to be spending as much time there, in some cases not spending any time there, then that's going to have follow-on effects for other businesses, small businesses particularly, that serve the people who work in or used to work in those areas. And at the same time, if there is going to be a long-term increase in working from home, at least a few days a week, then that may be creating opportunities for small businesses that are located more proximately to where the mostly high-wage workers who work in downtown business districts live. And what does that mean for the businesses and workers that we at ICIC are most concerned with? Those who are people of color and those who live and work and own businesses in under-resourced communities. Well, the competitive advantages might be shifting in a way that disadvantages those communities that depend for their prosperity, or what prosperity they have, on being highly proximate to downtown business districts. But it could be a good thing for the often overlooked under-resourced communities that are located in outlying areas. These are not the well-known under-resourced communities in the cores or near the cores of big cities, but outlying cities and towns that are at least as poor, at least as in need of economic development. So there may be a shift. We'll see how that plays out. There may be other spatial trends that are counteracting that we don't know about right now or haven't thought about. But that's my first reaction on that.
So, and to me, I think a lot of interesting research questions can come out of this. Just by looking at how the Great Resignation or this process can affect gender, race, ethnicity differently. And also another thing that's been on my mind is that, there has been very fast development of technology and automation and AI, but there's been some kind of resistance to use those technology in the workplace. But then the pandemic has kind of triggered a fast adoption of a lot of those techniques, and especially now that we're in a labor shortage, how would that push firms to start even, more aggressively start using those technology to deal with the labor shortage problem. So I think that's something, that's going to be interesting to look at in the future when more data becomes available.
Yeah, and I'll also echo something Dr. Haltiwanger said earlier. So estimates are uncertain as of now as to whether people are quitting to start new businesses, but I wonder about the longevity of those businesses that are starting up and what effects these kind of macroeconomic conditions will have over the next couple of years as people start settling into being a business owner, and how long that will last.
Well, I think that's like a critical issue, right? And indeed, I mean, a surge in startups leads to a surge in turnover, right? Is basically what that's what's going to happen. And you could say that's all the more reason we need to make sure the labor market remains robust. I mean, the thing about the second half of the 1990s was it was a remarkable period of quits and startups, and lots of those startups did fail, but indeed people landed on their feet is the thing. And so it's it's sort of a vicious cycle when you're in an environment where the labor market's very sluggish. It's hard to climb the job ladder. It's hard to get a job if you find yourself having lost a job. That's a very difficult time for somebody to take the risk to start up a business. And so we clearly live with that in the Great Recession. And in many ways, we lived with it for many years after. It was actually such a sluggish, not just the level of employment, but just the dynamics of the labor market were so sluggish. So having an environment that is conducive for individuals to be able to robustly climb the ladder turns out to be critical. Yeah, I don't think we know for sure what the silver bullet is in terms of what the policy environment is that you need to make that happen. Something I've worried a lot about. I often ask when I'll ask people when I get a chance to talk to the policymakers from the 1990s, and I'll ask them, what did you do right, or were you just lucky? Basically. So you ask people like Larry Summers and the like, and I think actually they will say they weren't just lucky, by the way. So.
Thank you, everyone, for addressing important issues. I want to touch on one final question. So, considering how smaller businesses are struggling to recover and considering the historical economic inequalities against business owners who are people of color, what recommendations do you have for large companies to work differently?
Well, one thing that's really critical is that smaller companies have fair access to procurement opportunities with large companies, as well as with large nonprofits and large government agencies. And these large institutional procurement offices are generally pretty conservative in the generic sense, in that they, if things are working well with their current suppliers, they're not particularly motivated to go out and find new suppliers, particularly among smaller businesses. They're used to doing business with the companies that they currently do business with, and they don't change unless there's a major problem. There are also issues related to the size of contracts. So unbundling large contracts to make them more accessible to smaller businesses would be helpful. And there are other features of the contracting system as well that are difficult for small businesses to navigate. In some cases, some of those difficulties can be addressed. They may not all be necessary. Those that are necessary can be addressed with more small business technical assistance, so that the small businesses can get their foot in the door, and better networking so that they can find out where the opportunities really are, and be able to bid in a timely and effective fashion on them.
So one thing, by the way, I agree very much with Howard. I think those are really interesting remarks. By the way, particularly in general, but given the literally trillions of dollars in terms of the infrastructure that's going to be allocated over the next several years, I do think we've seen in some cases large businesses really be work in a complementary fashion with small businesses, including new businesses on the e-commerce side. So actually Amazon and Walmart have been quite good, and actually they regard it as an important part of their business model is to be a platform for third-party sellers. And there's been an enormous growth in that area, and that's an area I think that kind of works. In many ways it makes sense in the world. There's all kinds of network externalities associated with all of us. We all like being on particular kind of platforms and so on. And if you can get, if indeed the small businesses can get to the consumers through those platforms, that's a good thing. So I don't know how to mimic that in other places, but actually I think that's been a win.
I think we're on time. I'd like to move on to the second panel. Before I hand over, I just want to thank everyone for joining today's discussion. I think we got a lot of helpful insights about this trend, about why people are leaving and what does it mean for entrepreneurship. So I'd like to close the first panel and transition to panel 2, moderated by Dr. Alex Bell.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me here today to moderate today's panel. I'm Dr. Alex Bell, and I'm a labor economist based at the California Policy Lab at UCLA. Since the start of the pandemic, our team at UCLA has issued 20 policy briefs on unemployment insurance and the state of the labor market in close collaboration with California's Labor Department. Much of this research is also forthcoming in economics journals, as well as a report on equity and access to benefits published just earlier this month by the United States Department of Labor. Some of our team's key findings in the administrative data sets have focused on the disparate impacts of the pandemic across demographic lines, highlighting the barriers that disadvantaged groups have faced in accessing benefits, and the importance of bolstering the country's outdated patchwork of unemployment insurance systems. Today, I'm excited to moderate a discussion on the Great Resignation and its potential impacts on the business landscape and self-employment. As a labor economist, I find this to be a very exciting topic, particularly because there's a lot that quantitative data aren't able to tell us quite yet. Data we have available to us now let us see that workers are quitting at a very high rate, and there are indications that median wages have risen, which is consistent with the labor supply shortage. Yet many questions remain for me, such as where workers are quitting to. Another question that remains to be seen is how much of the excess quits we're seeing now are actually related to workers who delayed quitting their jobs in the uncertainty near the start of the pandemic, which was a time when quit rates were actually unusually low. So now with that background, I don't want to take up too much more of the speaker's time. We'll be featuring 3 speakers today in the panel. The first will be Dr. Rachel Atkins, and then Dr. Sekou Bermiss, and finally Derek Ozkal. So I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, which will be Dr. Rachel Atkins. Dr. Atkins is the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Management and Organization at NYU Stern School of Business. When I spoke to her a few months ago, I enjoyed learning about her research on home ownership and Black-owned businesses. Since then, I've been closely following her other research at the intersection of race and entrepreneurship, and I was very excited to see her research on the Paycheck Protection Program get published earlier this month. So with that introduction, I'm excited to turn the floor over to Dr. Rachel Atkins.
Thank you so much. Before I jump into what I was planning to speak about, and I think that the transition here is great because what I'm going to speak about today is going to focus on potential long-term effects of the Great Resignation on racial equity in the business landscape and in self-employment. My work, as Alex mentioned, is mostly focused on issues of racial inequality in entrepreneurship. And so much of what the last panel spoke about is of tremendous interest to me. And so I kind of wanted to just jump in and piggyback off of something they said, or one of the discussions that they ended with. And I know that there's a discussion about the CPS data, but I just figured I would put this up for discussion. So this is a table from Rob Fairley's paper published in 2020 that looks at the CPS data for the number of active business owners by various demographic groups. And, you know, even with all the caveats that was mentioned about CPS, I did think it was important just to note some of the really large differences in the changes in the number of active business owners, particularly in that early period between February and April, and then also, you know, looking at how the changes decline over time. You still see pretty large gaps by race, even larger than what you observe between by gender. Even looking at the difference between February and June. There's still a sort of 19 percentage point difference, 19% difference between the self-employment numbers for Black as compared to what we observe for whites, which is only 5, and even the differences, you know, for Latinx folks and Asian business owners. And I think that's important when we think also about the outcomes of who we do observe in later periods. You know, my dissertation research looked at the Great Recession period. And one of the things that I found, and some other folks who've done work on that period find when looking at the race of business owners and what their outcomes were post Great Recession, sometimes when we observe cross-sectionally outcomes, we see that, you know, Black business owners had in some cases better outcomes than their white counterparts. But one thing that doesn't take into account is disproportionate rates of attrition. And I wanted to show this in part because I think we do have to wonder about attrition. And so perhaps seeing that business owners, Black business owners who are doing well, you know, in comparison to other groups is something that is a good thing. But I think we also have to wonder about the composition of those businesses as compared to the prior periods, and wonder a little bit if sort of the highest performing businesses disproportionately survived, and if that is part of what we're observing. But I did want to sort of get back to this question of the relationship between what we're calling this Great Resignation and potential business landscape and self-employment. And I did want to sort of harken back. I got a chance to look at Dr. Haltiwanger's paper, and talks about the shift towards remote activity and interactions between businesses and workers, and how, you know, that's potentially shifting the landscape for us. And when I saw that, I began to wonder about two things. I wondered about how use of e-commerce and the ability to engage in e-commerce might impact the racial composition of the business landscape going forward. And then I also wondered about how conditions in the tech labor market might impact how workers evaluate their labor market opportunities versus self-employment, particularly in the tech sector. So first I wondered about this, what I'm calling this pre-COVID-19 less than great resignation of people of color from tech. In certain circles, there were media reports, also in certain circles of Black and other people of color in tech, that were having these conversations before COVID-19 about, you know, not just people of color, but also women leaving tech because of these sort of toxic work environments. And I think the Great Resignation conversation really sort of amplified this idea that people are reevaluating their relationship with work. But this conversation in tech for people of color was going on prior to the Great Resignation. You know, lack of diversity in tech employment has been sort of this conversation piece for a really long time. It's just a news report that was reporting Google's own self-reported diversity employment data in 2020, but also reports from employees about, you know, not only the hiring practices being, you know, part of why we observe these differences, or excuse me, some of the disparities in hiring, but also just the retention issue and the way that a toxic work environment might cause people to leave. So the conversation is not just about the pipeline and getting people into tech, but also about retention and the extent to which retention is driving some of the low diversity outcomes that we see in tech. And of course, that led me to wonder about, you know, if people are leaving tech due to, you know, to the more toxic environments for people of color, are they switching to employment outside of tech, or are they going to self-employment? And I'm sort of engaged in that process. I don't have sort of data yet where I'm following individuals to see where they've gone after they've left tech. But one sort of just baseline exercise that I did do, joint work with April Barrage, a doctoral student in UMass Amherst, was just to look sort of at the ACS, the 5-year ACS data from 2014 to 2019. So again, pre-COVID. And I just wanted to look at the racial composition of tech employment and self-employment in tech, and how that compared to employment and self-employment more generally. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting looking at this was just the way that, you know, even among groups that over-index in tech employment, given that is potentially a benchmark, we don't see the same rates for tech self-employment. And then similarly, when we look at self-employment generally, we don't necessarily see the same rates of self-employment in tech. And many of the things that we talk about, for example, with Black workers or Hispanic workers and their entry into self-employment, things like differences in human capital or access to financial capital, one might think that somebody who's in the tech workforce already has a certain level of skill and potentially, you know, access to capital in ways that other workers wouldn't. And yet, looking at tech self-employment for Black workers, among self-employed workers, Blacks only account for 4.5% within tech. These are high-tech industries, as compared to 6.6% of tech employment overall, or 6.7% of self-employment overall. And so that raises questions for me about, you know, how might this look in a post-COVID-19 world, where folks, where the folks who are starting businesses may disproportionately be in sort of, you know, tech oriented sectors. You know, are people of color going to have, you know, a similar composition to pre-COVID periods? Will this shift? These are some points of discussion. And the second thing that I did, and I'm going to wrap up in a second here. The second thing that I did think about looking at Dr. Haltiwanger's paper was this e-commerce activity idea. And so I wondered about what the differences were by race in e-commerce activity for business owners prior to COVID-19. The most recent data that I could find for this was the annual survey of entrepreneurs, 2016. The industry data there is only at the two-digit level for the data that is publicly available. So I know he was looking at sort of 3-digit NAICS codes, which are a little bit more granular. But here I'm just showing all for across the board for all businesses. Because again, of the way the data is broken out in the publicly available data set, I'm showing the Hispanic versus non-Hispanic businesses owned by Hispanic versus non-Hispanic owners here on the left. And then business ownership is broken up by race on the right, but it doesn't account for ethnicity, if that makes sense. And so there are these differences in the share of businesses who report e-commerce sales in the 2016 data. Now, you know, this is several years old at this point, but I think it's still potentially worth looking at what the landscape was like prior to COVID-19, and thinking about how that might inform what we would expect to see in the current period. Looking at across racial groups, you know, there are these disparities in the percent of businesses reporting e-commerce sales as well. And then I just wanted to look at one more industry here. This is retail businesses. The retail businesses that do sort of online sales was a huge part of what I saw in Dr. Haltiwanger's paper is driving some of these new business applications. And again, this is all retail, not just, you know, that smaller 3-digit category, but I still thought it would be worth taking a look at. And here again, by ethnicity, we see a large difference in the share businesses reporting e-commerce sales, and then we see some smaller differences looking by race. Again, the ethnicity isn't broken out here. And then finally, accommodations and food service, looking at ethnicity. Again, it's consistent across many of the industries that I did look at these gaps, but there's a little bit of a different story in this industry. Looking by race, we see the highest, the racial group with the highest share of businesses engaged in e-commerce sales is actually African American. Smaller gap between white, Asian, and American Indian, Native American, and Alaskan Native here as well. So just some general thoughts, hopefully for conversation. Much of the literature talks a lot about three different kinds of capital, right? The capital, financial capital, social capital, and human capital by way of education and technical assistance. So when thinking about how these sort of past racial composition in technology employment and tech sector self-employment, as well as thinking about just e-commerce activity, all of this prior to COVID-19, what this might mean for this great resignation period post-COVID-19. I think some of the ways that we see industry sorting and the heterogeneity by industry and race and ethnicity in e-commerce, it has the potential, depending on industry, to exacerbate or ameliorate racial inequalities. So in cases where we see, industries that racial and ethnic minorities engaging in e-commerce activity, to the extent that those are sort of higher growth areas, we might see this as, an opportunity for closing some of the gaps that we observe. However, it could also go the other way, right, depending on where we see industry growth. Implications for policy. I think the biggest key here, and I think this came out in the last panel, is we just really need more data to be able to understand what's going on at a more granular level for businesses of color. We don't have enough real-time data. We really don't. We aren't able to break out a lot of the things that we want to know by race and ethnicity. We can look at geographic information to try and estimate what we think is going on, but the differences in residential racial composition and business owner racial composition are not, exactly overlapping. Alex mentioned a paper with, I'm at time, a paper with some other folks on PPP. And so I think looking at access to capital and innovative ways to get folks access to capital, like through fintechs, is going to be important as well. So that's all, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Atkins. And just a reminder to the audience, please enter your questions into the Q&A for our discussion at the end. Our next panelist will be Dr. Sekou Bermiss. Dr. Bermiss is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Keenan Flagler Business School. He is a thought leader in the field of strategic management and has extensively studied how firms and organizations attract and maintain talent. He is also the leader of the Filene Institute's War for Talent program. And during the pandemic, he has been producing fascinating and actionable insights about the future of work and employee attraction and retention in the shadow of COVID-19. So with that introduction, I'm excited to turn the floor over to Dr. Sekou Bermiss.
Thank you, Alex. Can you see me and hear me all right? Perfect. And by the way, can I record that snippet of an introduction and use it for my MBA classes? That would be great.
Sounds good.
World renowned, whatever that term was, I want to hear more of it. So welcome, everyone. Really excited to be here to talk about the topic and thinking about the Great Resignation. And when I drew my lot and knew I was going to be talking about kind of the long-term implications, I looked at that as an opportunity to be a little provocative, to kind of sit back and think about what are maybe some bigger shifts that I see happening within society and how we might start to think about these. And, you know, it's interesting when you're asked a question to present something like this, I'm always like, man, I don't know what I'm going to present. And as I sat and thought about it, I have two streams of research that are kind of crossing right here. And so what I'm going to do is make a proposition. So hopefully bring you along and let you see why I think these two things are crossing, and then how there's a lot of really interesting ideas based on what we already know about this topic, and also what's still left to be discovered, which I think is really, really important in this context. All right, so here's the proposition. So on the one hand, and I don't think I'm going to have to provide much evidence because the first panel did a good job of this. People are moving. People are moving around. They're quitting their jobs. They're moving for a variety of reasons. Some of it is forced, you know, necessity. Others, it's just some people calling it the great renegotiation or the great, all these alliterative things. I joined in that alliterative thing with the redesignation. But it's people are moving and exiting their organizations at a rate much higher than we've really seen, right? So this upward trend is occurring right now. What I would say is kind of orthogonal to that, organizations for the last, I'd say, 10 years have become more active within social and political kind of questions, right? So having done some research, I'll give you some examples, and these are 5 years old. There are some more egregious examples that I could bring up, but I figured I'll stay safe with some older examples. So BP, for example, started to provide some benefits for employees that donated to their PAC, that they would get choice parking spots, right? And trying to bring employees in to the PAC. And obviously that PAC is going to then advocate for certain policies, support certain candidates, right? So in a way, they're bringing their employees into this kind of political landscape. Coke Industries, a little more heavy-handed, sent out packets informing their employees about candidates that were running for president at the time. Published an editorial as well with some critiques about one of the candidates. And then a company called Murray Energy had a situation where a forewoman was fired because she didn't respond to the company CEO, who had sent out these letters asking for literal donations. And because she did not wish to donate to this political cause, she was fired, and this whole kind of thing kind of spilled out. And so I bring all these up to say is, these are very specific examples, but if you just look at the general tenor within the corporate space right now, the idea of an activist CEO being the anomaly is gone, right? I think we have much more where CEOs are feeling it's part of their job to at least lead and make decisions based on what they believe is right. And whereas before, what they believe to be right might be more couched in kind of economic, rational sorts of ideas, much more we're seeing more ideological justifications about what is right. Right. And as such, they're bringing ideology kind of into the workplace. Right. So it's never polite to talk about politics in company. That is gone. Right. And so a paper that I published with a colleague, Rory McDonald, who's at Harvard Business School, we looked at this idea about political ideology and how it plays a part within organizations. Right. So again, hot button topic, but one that our own anecdotally, we felt, man, there used to be a time where you wouldn't know anybody's political beliefs. Now I know everybody's political beliefs. What is that going to do regarding how people think about where they want to work, how much they want to, career ideas, career opportunities, et cetera. So the study, and we wrote an HBR kind of summarizing, just talked about when you're a misfit, meaning maybe you are a liberal within a conservative dominated organization, or the reverse, you're conservative in a liberally dominated organization. That's going to impact kind of your motivations about whether or not you want to stay. What is also interesting, we found in the paper, is that it also impacts where you end up going. So if you were a misfit, let's say you were a conservative in a very liberal organization, you are more likely to leave, and you were more likely to join an organization that was more ideologically aligned with your beliefs. Okay, so that's the second thing that I've seen kind of through my own studies, is that this idea of making choices about where you work, about things in the organizational space are becoming more, I'd say, ideological, or at least that's being discussed. So let's put these two together. And what does it mean for the Great Resignation and entrepreneurship? Well, what I argue to say, like this mass exit, as well as an increased dialogue where we're starting to reveal some of our ideological differences, and if we're being honest, separating ourselves, sorting based on these ideological differences, is there perhaps hidden within the Great Resignation, perhaps a great ideological redesignation, right? So perhaps while people are leaving their firms and deciding what to do now, are they using ideology, which was, again, I'd say something maybe even 15 years ago was not a very salient idea within thinking about hiring or recruiting or why people left, but now very much is, right? Might we actually see some sorting that occurs based on these contexts? All right, so what do we know on this? And I'll move quickly through this, because if I've hopefully sold you on my proposition, I think what follows should be pretty straightforward, right? So we know people leave firms, and when they do, they seek self-employment. What we also know from the strategic human capital literature is the most qualified employees are most likely to start a new firm, right? So if you just look at everyone that leaves, the ones that tend to be paid the highest, have the highest potential, they are much more likely to start new firms, and they're much more likely to become entrepreneurs. Now, these highly qualified employees are going to choose their startup teams. And when you look at the startup literature, homophily is a really strong indicator. Engineers tend to meet with engineers and the like, right? And so there's not as much diversity. If left to their own devices, people like who they like, and they choose to start up organizations with people that they like. As ideology has become more salient, you can imagine that you would expect to see these new ventures become more ideologically similar, right? So what we have to figure out, I think, or what's interesting to me to think about, and this is 5-10 years, right, as we move forward, is how might this redesignation, this sorting impact the entrepreneurial ecosystem as a whole, right? In a lot of different places. So I'll propose 3 kind of ideas. One that I'm doing a fair bit of current research in right now, and 2 others that I've thought about, but I don't really have any projects to speak to. So the first is on the investor side, right? So if you imagine sorting is happening, and it's something that's salient, how is this impacting investment? How is it impacting the way that angel investors are kind of getting together and thinking about where they want to invest their money? The idea of value investing and the like. Is it making an impact? i.e., are different angel investors thinking about ideology as they make decisions? And then on the VC side, you have these professional investors, and there's some research within finance to show that there is some bias, but there's some strong governance and incentives to make sure things don't get too far out of whack. But what happens when you have VC and venture misalignment, or you have a syndicate with some misalignment? How does that impact the amount that they're willing to invest? How does that impact the actual viability of that venture and kind of governance of that venture moving forward? So on the angel side, I have a project with a number of co-authors, collected a bunch of data looking at this and looking at how the trends, and we're finding that there are some differences along ideological spectrum that we should at least be aware of. And on the VC side, I am also in the process with another co-author at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, looking to collect this data and think about the network dynamics around syndicate investment and how ideology might be playing a role there, right? Aside from that, you can think about founding teams. Again, sorting or not sorting, is this impacting creativity? We know diversity helps with creativity, and does that hurt viability, right? So if left to their own devices, this sorting might actually lead to less innovative new ventures. And then kind of big picture, if you think about ecosystems that develop in certain communities, right? I've moved from one ecosystem in Austin to another in the research triangle, very different ecosystems. And as this sorting continues, I think the people holding the tills of this, right? Entrepreneur support organizations, accelerators, et cetera, policymakers, are they being aware of this so they can continue to build integrated and inclusive ecosystems ideologically, or left on devices, separate and potentially contentious ecosystems, right? And so understanding this, thinking about this, collecting data to see to what extent this is actually creating an impact, I think is a lot of what we have left to figure out. I'm excited to do that myself in some way, and also to talk about this with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bermiss, for sharing these insights you're seeing on company ideologies and how it's impacting the entrepreneurial landscape. I want to remind the audience to put questions into the Q&A. Our next and final panelist will be Derek Ozkal. Mr. Ozkal is a senior program officer at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. He is a thought leader in the field of entrepreneurship research and the future of work, and he's someone I've come to count on to always have his finger on the pulse of the latest research in the field of entrepreneurship. Every time I talk to Mr. Ozkal, I learn more about the exciting research going on and new ideas for the important research questions that lie ahead. So with that introduction, I'm excited to turn the floor over to our final speaker, Derek Ozkal.
Thanks so much, Alex. I appreciate the kind introduction. So because we're at this point in the presentations, I think that a lot of what I would talk about has been accurately covered by so many others already. And so I'll be brief in echoing some of those key points, but hopefully I'll be able to kind of add some nuance into some of these questions and kind of combine together some of the common themes being seen. At a high level, I try to think about this topic as simply as possible because it is a very dynamic and complex situation. But at a high level, what's going on? So a few things certainly already discussed about today already, which is work itself is changing. There are multiple factors that are contributing to that. And its connection to the Great Resignation or other alliterative term of your choice. And then workers are changing jobs. And then that has implications for new businesses and self-employment as well. And the lens that I think it will be helpful to think about these types of topics is probably the most important, which is, why does this matter? And I think Rachel did a wonderful job kind of highlighting the way that I think about this in terms of what gets lost in the average. If we look at the overall indicators, you may be able to tell one story, but at the average, is the result of a wide spectrum of different outcomes for multiple people, and different support structures that exist for people across that spectrum look very different. And so it's important to think about those implications and the supports that are necessary to create equitable opportunities for everyone. So as highlighted by many others, there's certainly a change afoot, and some of this is not new. All of these activities, I think this has been highlighted as well already today, that technological change and structural changes in the economy have been taking place for a while. But there are some things that the pandemic certainly has accelerated and increased the likelihood of becoming even more different in the future. So I won't get too far into like the technical components of thinking through about automation and artificial intelligence, except that those are increasingly becoming considerations in terms of how businesses may structure themselves, and thus how startups may structure themselves as well. And certainly the emergence of platforms. I believe in the comment section, there's some discussion thinking through whether the growth of platforms like Amazon Marketplace, what does that have for self-employment and for startups and young businesses. And though it's true, it certainly opens up markets that would otherwise not exist for these young firms. It also opens up competition that they would not normally face. And it also, there are questions about to what degree the value of that platform is equal to the cost of being on those platforms in terms of the operating costs that are given to the platform holders. So there's tension there, and I think an important area for research to understand that as the emergence of platforms become increasingly important for entrepreneurship, thinking through the mechanisms that are most helpful for those new and young businesses. And then of course, work structures themselves too. Certainly a topic common today was about self-employment, but thinking through gig work and side hustles and independent contracting. And then certainly as highlighted, depending on what types of data you're looking at, if it's a survey, survey data, depending on how the question is answered, there may be very different responses you get into terms of how people identify the work that they do and where they would show up in a data set. All of this to say that terms that we've been using for a long time may no longer be capturing some of the economic activity. And to be more precise, like things like job may not accurately describe the work people do to generate income. And that can have important consequences for as we try to measure these things. And then, of course, another way work has been changing, accelerated by the pandemic, is thinking through like the actual location where it is done. Certainly not all of the population of the labor market has the opportunity to work from home, but a significant portion does. And long-term will have the technical capability to do a core part of their job remotely. Now, this will be a great experiment if from one way of looking at this is to see to what degree these hybrid approaches become normal across multiple industries. And I have a graph here from Nick Bloom and others looking at some of the work from home research. And there's huge variation in terms of those who can work from home, their desire to want to do so. Some people basically never want to do it. Some people want to do only that. And then some people, of course, fall in the middle. Many firms are landing on the middle. To what degree that is going to be a component of maybe another round of this great reshuffling, job switching remains to be seen. But that is certainly occurring. There can be some questions about the exact magnitudes. And I think it's been highlighted, like, it's not that everyone who leaves a job starts a company or becomes self-employed. Some take traditional jobs, some retire, some do the contract work, some are taking other traditional jobs and working on side hustles. You know, that is certainly part of the entrepreneurial process for many people, is that it is not an immediate transition, although sometimes it certainly can be. But one thing that is clearly happening is there's some acceleration of this churn. And there's some interesting implications for the business landscape as well, too. I think there's some real questions about where we will land on some of these new management structures in terms of like, what is the best way to operationalize a hybrid workforce? For which industries and which companies, which locations does this make the most sense? How do companies wrestle with having sectors of their workforce that could work from home with those that have customer facing positions that have to be in person? How do you manage an organization with those types of dynamics? There are multiple ways that companies could approach this, and it will be important to see what the consequences are for all of those. So we'll get, likely there'll be emerging new best practices and different ways to organize, to structure these organizations, and then perhaps maybe closer related to like some of the supply chain issues. But I think there's also a question too about firms operationalizing around efficiency versus resiliency. So certainly the supply chain disruptions have shown that being incredibly efficient, when part of that becomes no longer available, it halts everything else. There's a cascading effect. And so what would it look like to restructure firms instead of with as few workers or as capital as possible to produce a good, instead to be very resilient to disruptions so that you could maintain smoother flows? To what degree companies could even reorganize like that, I think is an open question as well too. And then the other part of the landscape, I have a couple of graphs here looking from a venture capitalist evaluating their portfolio of firms. And I think what's really interesting is thinking about these. So this is a very small set of the universe of firms, but high growth oriented, venture capital backed firms. Thinking about if they could start a business anywhere, where would be the best place to do so for their long-term success? And very quickly, the pandemic I think this highlights one way that the pandemic has really shown that the technology may offer opportunities that we didn't realize before. So from going from yes, we should be in the Bay Area to probably the best is to be distributed or remote. That's a pretty dramatic, sudden change. It'll be interesting to see what the long-term effects of this are and if that remains to be true over time. And then, as others have highlighted, there are questions about the long-term resiliency of some of the changes that we're seeing and the increase in self-employment and new business starts, but almost, and also it will take time to see how many of these turn and grow in the same way that businesses before did, and also to see if the traditional patterns for survivorship are the same as well. But there certainly does seem to be a huge increase in movement of work to these new types of, not new types, but increasingly being concentrated in things like self-employment or new business starts. So there's definitely some shuffling going on there in terms of the exact magnitudes. I think for all the reasons that have been discussed already today, there's some open questions about that. But where I'd really like to focus some attention is about, why does this matter? And I think the way I think about this most cleanly is that it's not as if this new normal return that we're thinking about, that we would want it to be 2019, because the world was not working for everyone in 2019. And so as we think about during COVID, post-COVID, if that's a thing, I think it's important to think about what works for who. And I think there are some concerning trends that were taking place before or have been accelerated during the pandemic. So things like wealth concentration, and I mean that across in multiple ways. So like individual wealth concentration probably gets maybe the most coverage in terms of what people might think about, but also thinking about industry concentration and firms, that's getting some more coverage too, as there's questions about what types of connections there are between firm power and maybe even connections to things like inflation and profits versus for firms versus price increases, et cetera. And then also like area concentration too, like certainly some cities or metropolitan areas versus non-metropolitan areas are certainly doing better than other areas. And I think that there it's very easy to see that there can be concerns with concentration when it's also coupled with growing inequality. And so wealth inequality, when it's also concentrating, like it's one thing if everyone's getting richer, but the richest are getting a little more richer than everyone else. But when the gap is also spreading out, I think those two trends combined mean that we need to be cognizant of some of the consequences for what is happening across the economy. And then the fragility or absence of support. So certainly things like caregiving was really highlighted by the pandemic, like how little resiliency were in many people's work arrangements and the income that they needed to support themselves and their families, and the absence of support too. So for example, some of this economic activity and change that we're seeing may be a result of some implications of some policies that were new. So I know Alex and others are looking at like unemployment insurance to see that for the first time, certainly being available to the self-employed. There's a lot of research questions to understand to what degree that is, perhaps driving some of this change. I already talked about some of the growth of platforms and kind of the give and take about that. And then also highlighting that, some of this growth in self-employment, like it was certainly driven by those moving from unemployment to entrepreneurship. That's not necessarily bad, but it does mean that we need to think about the types of support structures people have, because when we think about the movement of people, like it's one thing to assume that it's always choice, but choice is driven by options and your what's available to you and the support structures you have. Now, that's not to say that this is all bad and that we have no recourse here, because I think there's a lot of encouraging things as well too. Like there's certainly tremendous public attention about these issues that I don't think existed just a few years ago. And that includes into thinking about, the worker perspective. Like one big component of the reshuffling or great resignation, whatever we want to call it, is that it is showing some labor market power for the workers, which is perhaps a new, at least in terms of the scale, is certainly new in the macro economy. And then there's successes from hybrid and work from home. Like, I mean, many businesses most had to be forced into it by literally a health pandemic. But in terms of like output, like most companies and workers, it went far better than they expected. And there's a lot of innovations and new business starts in this space. So the technology we're using now will only improve and get better. And I think that there's a lot of open questions about what this will look like moving forward. So I'll leave with that. Why these issues really matter is because they will not necessarily lead to the new normal that we may want, but we can help improve that by being deliberate about the support structures and getting at the nuance of how this affects everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those insights on the changing landscape of businesses. I want to thank all the panelists at this point and bring the panelists back together for a Q&A session. I want to remind the audience, please type your Q&A into the Q&A box. And I want to start it off with my own question, which I feel like we've danced around a little bit. Some of these programs that were implemented during the pandemic. Derek just mentioned pandemic unemployment insurance assistance, the PUA program, and Dr. Atkins was also mentioning the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program. I thought maybe I'd just kick it to Dr. Atkins for a moment to say a little bit more about the Paycheck Protection Program. As we're talking today about this exodus of workers from firms, the Paycheck Protection Program was sort of meant to keep workers attached to the firms. Can you say a little bit more about the program and sort of share if you feel like it did its job in that regard?
Sure. Well, first I'll hop back on my soapbox, or I'll hop on a soapbox that I frequent, which is data. I wish we had more data on the PPP. What we could do was very limited in our analysis in that regard. But you're right. I mean, the PPP really wasn't about businesses. It was about workers. It was about keeping people employed. So in that regard, thinking about it in terms of its sort of ability to support business owners is a little bit awkward, because that really wasn't who it was for. It was to keep people employed. And to the extent that it did its job, the impact of that on new business creation, we would expect that to sort of be working against that, right? Because people would be the funding was intended to keep people's paychecks coming, and so to the extent that we think about in crisis periods, people starting businesses from unemployment, right? We wouldn't have seen that. On the flip side, it is possible that it contributes to the Great Resignation in a sense, because rather than people who might have otherwise lost their jobs, then sort of in the flow of things choosing to enter self-employment, they still had their jobs. So they, if they were going to switch to unemployment, it was going to be because they resigned from the jobs that they had. So I'm not really, it's hard to really think about how that impacted this sort of decision between workers entering self-employment. But I guess what I can say that I thought was potentially a positive outcome that we found in our work when we looked at the first phase of the Paycheck Protection Program, we were looking at differences in the loan amounts given the characteristics of businesses that we could control for, obviously given limits in data. And in the first phase, we saw pretty large disparities between Black and white business owners who received PPP loans. In the later phases of the program, there were many more participants. In addition to traditional commercial banks, there were also fintechs, nonprofits, and so on. And we do see some evidence that the gaps in loan amounts awarded to businesses, the gaps by race in those loan amounts did decline. They didn't disappear, but we saw them sort of shrink. And we sort of take from that on the one hand, some of these fintechs, especially, and we did a separate paper where we looked just at fintechs, are able to get rid of the discretionary aspect of lending right through their algorithms. And we think that to the extent that perhaps they remove that sort of unconscious bias or what have you, that may have contributed to some of the reduction in the disparity, but that there are some structural things there that getting rid of people doesn't erase. And so I think that's really important for us going forward to think about, to the extent that people are going to be making this transition from labor market work to self-employment, and we're concerned about equity consequences, the ability of people to be able to access capital if they're hoping to make that transition is going to be important. And we can't ignore the differences in the ability of folks to do that based on their race or ethnicity.
I want to give the other panelists also a chance to respond to that, and also put the sort of next question about the PUA program out there. There was a big push at the start of the pandemic to have a program like unemployment insurance, but that's insuring the self-employed. It's a very risky career, so it makes sense to have some sort of insurance. I think that there have, been some issues with how it was rolled out with income verification, things like that. I just wondered, do any of the panelists have perspective on whether this is a program that should become more of a permanent institution in the American labor market, or whether it's something that, should just, it's already expired, should just be done with?
I'll jump out on this as the least qualified to answer the question. I'll be first to jump in. So I find on the policy side, so I don't know the policy, but the political, the ideology around a lot of these policies kind of resonates to me. And so the idea of a policy that provides a cushion for everyone sounds very equitable. But another view would say it sounds like welfare, right? Like it sounds like it's taking spoils that should be given to those that are successful and giving it to everyone, kind of sharing it. And one of the things that pops up time and time again whenever we do these ideology kind of studies within organizations is that depending on where you lie on the spectrum, you are more or less comfortable with inequities, right? And this goes less to does the inequity exist and more to should the inequity exist. And this is where I think the rubber meets the road. I think we can all agree this might help, this might help. The thing with ideology I find so interesting, it's about what you think should be. And so if you think, hey, the natural way things are, that there are haves and there are have-nots, and that is the natural order of things, how are you going to approach a policy that you mentioned, right, and support it? It's gonna be a very different conversation than someone who feels like, well, no, I think any kind of inequality is probably not right. It probably means something's wrong, something's broken. And those are kind of two diametrically opposed views along the same spectrum, right? Around this comfort within inequality. And this happens with like managers and bosses, but this also happens with, if you're sitting on a board of director and you're thinking about how much should the CEO get paid or not, if you're a VC and thinking about how should we divvy up equity, all of these things kind of play into it. And so I think your question is good, but I think it's also one of these questions that is in the crosshairs of these ideological divides.
I'll echo that by saying I think that's a fantastic way to think about the consequences of even trying to answer this question. That really makes it very difficult, I think, in terms of finding common ground on even how to approach some of these issues. I guess that's part of why I structured the comment I said with like, it's difficult to make a case for like exactly where you want to see what levels of concentration of wealth or whatever it might be. But I think in general, it's probably concerning to many people if you see wealth concentrating at the same time that you see decreasing mobility, so the ability for others to pursue that. Like, I think those two things indicate that even if you're okay with extreme changes and extreme differences in income and concentration, if people can't get to move among where they're at, then that's concerning. Because then you're not in a place where it is truly a meritocracy. Like you're not seeing the equitable opportunity. Again, I think you can at least conceptually make a pretty strong case for that occurring right now. But it's a great point that this will always be steeped in a worldview in terms of like what the goal is. And I think that's a great point and a challenging one in terms of trying to find common ground.
I'm seeing another question popping in through the chat, and it's mostly aimed at Dr. Bermiss, but I'll pose it to the panel as well. I think broadly, we want to understand what are the specific benefits that entrepreneurs ought to be offering to attract more labor right now. Is it paid vacation? Is it more like a sign-on bonus or higher wages? What are the types of benefits that entrepreneurs need to be offering right now?
All right, I'll go first. I'm brave. So Heather, I was reading through the question, and it's not an uncommon one. So I do like writing online and have a lot of discussions with folks. And I've actually been kind of coining this term war on talent, right? Rather than the war for talent. And some of it is because it just became apparent, at least the dialogue became employers, employees in a very new kind of battle sorts of discussion, right? We're holding out, we're going to stage protests, and it's kind of back and forth. So the vitriol, I think, stems from a lot of what Heather talks about, which is there's a lot of contestation that's happening there. Now, that said, I do think, if we're being honest, the cost of living moved up and wages did not keep up for a while. Now, it's always painful to say, all right, so you're telling me in a midst of 6 months, I have to make up for 15 years of this, like now? So I have to pay you all your back pay and I have to pay for that doesn't seem fair. But I think that's the first kind of volley in the negotiation. And so, my sense is that the negotiated amount will be somewhere in the middle. The talk is really about respect and what's fair and a living wage. And so I think we can get the data that shows, hey, what is a living wage for someone working 40 hours a week, et cetera, and come to some terms of agreement. But we have to move past the position is I walk out if you don't give me $1,000 signing bonus. And if you are asking for more than I'm offering, then you're ungrateful, right? And that's where we get past kind of the ideology, which is the positions, and get more towards the interests, which is you want employment. We want the ecosystem to work. Off my soapbox.
Thank you. I think we're about at the top of the hour. I think that's all the time that we have. And I want to make sure that I turn it back over to Anya to wrap up and discuss next steps for the posting.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, everybody, for participating in the forum today. And thank you for our attendees for joining us for this important conversation. We had a rich conversation. I think there is just so much more that we could be discussing in this area, and 2 hours is obviously not enough. So this forum has been recorded, and we are going to share the video in the future. I also want to take this moment as an opportunity to announce our next forum scheduled for March 24th. The topic is entrepreneurship in the midst of digital transformation. It will be kind of a continuation of this conversation, and hopefully we'll have more interesting information emerge from that conversation. So registration link and link to our recorded forums are in the chat. And we will also be sharing more information about the upcoming forum and other events in our Insights to Entrepreneurship newsletter. So you can find the link to where you can sign up for it and in the chat as well. We hope that you will join us in our future events, and thank you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.